It had been 5 years since my divorce and I was now 43 years old, spending every one of those years sleeping alone until that Tuesday night I'll never forget. That night when I lay in bed, the exhaustion wrapping around me felt like a heavy blanket. Silence filled every corner of the house as usual, but this time that peaceful silence didn't last long. I heard a knock at the door. Soft. Hesitant, I opened my eyes and sat up in the darkness of the room. Something didn't feel right. Adrian, I called out. Mom, came my son's voice, a whisper in the dark. The door creaked open and Adrian stepped inside. He looked timid in his pajamas, but those weren't a child's pajamas anymore. They belonged to a 22-year-old young man. The expression on his face sparked a protective instinct in me, yet at the same time I felt uneasy. I can't sleep, he finally said, staring down at the floor. Come here, I said, patting the empty spot next to me on the bed. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over and slipped under the blanket. The bed creaked slightly with his weight. Now we were lying side by side with just a few inches between us. Adrian's warmth was immediately noticeable. I tried not to look at him, but out of the corner of my eye it was impossible not to see that he wasn't a child anymore. He had grown into a young man. His features had sharpened, his shoulders had broadened, and that realization embarrassed me and confused me at the same time. Mom, he murmured, his face turned toward me. I don't know, sometimes I feel so alone in this house. His voice was so fragile that I couldn't respond. Instead, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. In that moment, without hesitation, he turned toward me and hugged me tightly. The strength of his embrace surprised me. His arms wrapped all the way around me, his face close to my neck. I could feel his heartbeat. His breath was warm and steady, but the most surprising thing was how I found myself responding in kind. As I hugged him back, a strange flutter stirred in my chest. Adrian's face moved slightly closer to my neck, his breath brushing against my skin. Sometimes it's just too much, he said in a quiet voice. I'm here, I whispered. I'm always here, but inside I wasn't at ease. My heart was racing and I couldn't understand why this warmth felt so overwhelming. There was an innocence in Adrian's action, sure, but his hug was tighter than I had expected, his warmth closer than I had anticipated. Thank you, Mom, he murmured. His eyes closed and finally his breathing slowed. He had fallen asleep, but I couldn't sleep as I lay there perfectly still. One question kept spinning in my mind. What the hell just happened tonight? There was something way too intimate about the way Adrian hugged me, and even more unsettling was the fact that I couldn't just brush it off. When morning came, Adrian was still asleep next to me. The first rays of sunlight lit up his face. My eyes lingered on him. He still looked innocent, but inside I felt completely tangled up. I rested my head back on the pillow and took a deep breath. I needed time to figure out what last night was all about. But one thing was for sure, this wasn't just another night. Morning came. The sunlight crept into my room slowly, waking me up. In that moment I realized I was still carrying the weight of the emotions that had swirled through me all night. Adrian was still there, deeply asleep. I carefully got out of bed and headed for the kitchen. I needed some time to myself and I wanted to prepare something without waking him. Adrian always woke up late in the mornings, but today I knew I had to do something to calm the uneasiness brewing inside me. As I wrestled with my thoughts about the night before, I started gathering Ingredients for pancakes. A few minutes later, Adrian began to stir. I caught a glimpse of him peeking out from behind the door, his eyes still half closed. "Morning," he said, but there was something strange in his tone. He sounded both tired and careful. "Morning, honey," May I replied. Looking at him, I was trying my best to act normal as I flipped the pancakes. I could feel Adrian's gaze on me. There was something different about the way he looked at me. His demeanor wasn't as indifferent as it usually was. It was like he was watching my every move, paying attention to every little thing I did. I stirred slowly, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around me, but so did the growing unease inside me. Adrian's eyes, just like the night before, were on me again this morning, but this time there was a strange intensity in them. I noticed it. His eyes weren't just on me. They were scanning me. They were tracing the shape of my body, and I could feel it. For a few seconds I tried to ignore his stare, but I could sense he'd picked up on my uneasiness. Deep down I felt my heart start to race, but I worked hard to keep my cool, to act like everything was perfectly normal. Adrian's behavior had shifted too. Normally he was more laid back, calm and cheerful with me, but this morning there was a distance. He drawn a line, but it was like he was searching for the courage to tiptoe across it, his eyes catching the morning light. Looked at me like he wanted to say something, but I couldn't quite figure out what. I placed the pancakes on a plate and handed it to him. "Enjoy," I said, a bit gloomily. When Adrian took the plate, his hands gripped it briefly and his eyes met mine for a fleeting moment. Again it felt like he was trying to see something deeper in me. I noticed the nervous reflection in my own eyes, but Adrian didn't say a word. He just sat down at the table. Throughout breakfast he didn't look directly into my eyes even once, but every time I moved, his gaze shifted down from the ceiling, landing back on me with that same different intensity. It was like he was hyper-aware of every small thing I did. This wasn't something we'd ever experienced before. The turmoil inside me grew. Something within whispered, "You need to figure this out now," but I still didn't fully understand what this was. It was the way Adrian's glances and behavior created this deep emotional confusion in me. And now in the kitchen, surrounded by the warm smell of pancakes, that strange tension lingered. Something was stirring inside me, but I resisted it. I was fully aware of Adrian's eyes on me, but all I wanted was to do my job as a mother. This morning was supposed to just be about breakfast, but the warmth and uneasiness coursing through me as the sunlight crept in, they felt like something entirely different. As night approached, sleep started to weigh on my eyes. Something felt different. I could feel it, but I couldn't figure out what it was. As the night went on, the loneliness in my room grew heavier, but this time something had shifted. Adrian's behavior toward me seemed to be evolving into something else. Slowly I drifted into sleep, though I found myself opening and closing my eyes. Throughout the night I could feel something coming, but I didn't know what. Suddenly I heard a noise. My eyes fluttered open. In the dark room I could make out a shadow moving slowly. Something inside me trembled, startled. Everything blurred for a second, but then I realized that shadow was Adrian. He had stepped into the room through the slightly open door. My eyes shot open and my heart started pounding. My son, in the middle of the night, was in my room. Despite knowing I was supposed to be asleep, Adrian's eyes glinted in the darkness with a kind of intensity that reminded me of the night before. For a moment I tried to focus my gaze what was, I suppose, to do, the confusion inside me grew louder and louder. Adrian being in my room at this hour was strange enough, but it also felt like some kind of echo. Only this time it was different. His eyes, his demeanor, the way he stepped closer to me, it all carried meaning. Adrian took another step forward. He moved closer, and with the only light left in the room, the moonlight, I could see his face a little more clearly. His eyes were more determined than I'd ever seen them, deep inside. Something screamed at me, "Don't stop it!" But in that moment Adrian suddenly leaned in and pressed his lip against mine. It all happened in an instant. For a moment everything froze. Time stood still in that instant. It felt as if the world was spinning around me. But I was motionless, my son just a step away, and as he left a kiss on my lips, all my emotions tangled together. This wasn't something a mother expects from her child. In that moment it made me feel as though my heart suddenly started pounding wildly. I quickly pulled away and tried to push him back. "Stop!" "No," I said breathlessly. My words seemed to vanish into the air like a whisper. Adrian pulled back, leaving a trace of what seemed like disappointment in his eyes, but he still stood there tall in the room. "Adrian, this isn't right. Don't do this." My voice trembled, my head spun, and my body was soaked in sweat. I couldn't control the feelings inside me. My son Appr approaching me this way, how terrifying, how complicated it was. But on the other hand, I couldn't deny the attention, the focus he was giving me. But this wasn't right. I had to remain a mother forever, right? The intense gaze in my son's eyes, a gaze I had never seen before, shook me deeply. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, but I knew I had to pull myself together. Adrian took a step back. He remained silent without saying a word, but the silence grew deeper in the darkness. Then Adrian came closer and once again placed a kiss on my lips, his hands moving down from my neck first to my waist, then to my hips. No matter how much I told myself to stop, I couldn't resist that night. Whatever happened had happened. I woke up in the morning trying to understand what had transpired. Adrian wasn't beside me, and I was alone in the room. I took a deep breath, trying to collect myself. I left the house without saying a word. There was a weariness in my eyes, an emptiness in my chest. My steps felt heavy, like I was lost as I fought within myself. The only thing I knew for certain was that I needed to understand what had happened. I was questioning what I was feeling, but everything with each passing second seemed more and more complicated. That night, whatever happened had happened. By morning, everything felt like a dream, so tangled. My eyes ached, my heart was racing. But I left the house without saying a word. I tried to cover up what had happened between Adrian and me. As I struggled to understand, I decided to suppress all my emotions, to erase it all. But something inside me was breaking. I was questioning myself. Why did I feel so mixed up? I felt like I was lost in this chaos. My son was no longer just a child, but was I still seeing him as a child? Was I fooling myself? What should I do? All these questions kept swirling in my mind, but they remained unanswered.